go through this seminar. It's now being recorded. Fantastic. So you'll get this recording sent out to you. So if you have to dip out at any point, you're not going to miss anything. You'll get all the all this, including slides, notes, whatever else. I would recommend having a notepad handy during this so that you can take any notes as they come up. But don't feel you need to copy everything down from the screen because, as I say, you'll get the notes coming out to you. Just anything that kind of appeals to you and feels like it's useful information and anecdotes. So let's look. We've got a few people in. I'm sure more people might filter in as we go through. But whatever the case, let's kick things off, shall we? Welcome to Adapting Existing Properties. If out of interest, quick show of hands in the chat, who has not been to one of our seminars before? I know we've got some people that are new attendees. We've been running these seminars for a little while now, so I'd be keen to know if people have been before, or if people haven't been before. If you haven't, though, and if you're watching this back later, if you're not here live, let me talk a little bit about myself briefly, if you'll let me indulge that for a moment. So my name is James Hewitt. I've been designing tabletop games for about 8 years now, I think, professionally, full-time-ish. Here's a bunch of stuff I've worked on. There's a whole lot more stuff I've worked on over the past couple of years, which hasn't come out yet because of various lockdown-related reasons, lockdown and other things like the whole thing with the canal last year. I want to say the Suez Canal. Was it the Suez Canal where a large ship got stuck sideways and it utterly messed with the board games industry, among with other industries? But several things that we've been working on over the past couple of years haven't come out yet. But suffice to say, I've worked on a lot of licensed or adapted games. You can see a few here. So we've got the Hellboy board game, the Devil May Cry board game, bottom right there. And several games which I designed when I was working for Games Workshop, all of which were based in existing universes. So as well as that, at NeedyCat Games, we make tabletop games. We help people polish and refine their own games. If you've got a game that you would like us to help you with, you can contact us and we can maybe do some consultancy and help you out. We also run workshops and courses like this one here. That should hopefully come as no surprise to you. Tonight, though, specifically, we're talking about adapting existing properties. So I'm going to start off with some basics on intellectual property. I can talk honest. And we'll talk a bit about some of the basic terms around it, some of the basics for how licensing agreements tend to work. We'll then give you a little walkthrough of like the licensing process as it usually is. As I'll say at the time, it always varies. But this should hopefully give you a good overview. I'll talk about designing within an IP and also reshaping an IP. So one of those is about kind of how to stick to an IP, and the other one is how to kind of fudge the details a little bit if it doesn't quite fit. And we'll finish up with talking about some common pitfalls that adapted games make before we go into a Q&A. My aim, as ever, is to finish this by 9 o'clock, so about 2 hours. I'm generally pretty good at getting more or less on time. I tend to keep an eye on the clock throughout. So hopefully we will be more or less on time there. However, we are going to be doing like Q&A sessions throughout. So depending on how many of those there are, we might run a little bit over. We might run a little bit short. Either way, I've got 2 hours worth of packed content. And hopefully you'll get a lot out of this. Throughout the thing, you've got the chat window there. You are welcome to put some questions in as they come up. Those of you that sent in questions in advance, thank you ever so much. I've tried to cover off most of the questions within the main content of the seminar, but at the end I've got a little round of quick fire questions, which are things that I couldn't really necessarily fit into other things, but I want to answer them for you. If anyone else has any questions, just pop them up in the chat. Hello, whoever just turned up. I just saw we got one extra person, but I can't see who it was. You haven't missed much yet from talking about myself. If you have any questions, though, pop them into the chat. And I will either cover them off at the end of the topic, or if it's like a question that kind of deserves its own topic, we'll cover it at the end of the Q&A. Hugh, no worries at all. If you really want to go back and catch the sort of 5 minutes of me talking about myself, you'll get a recording afterwards, don't worry. Right then, so let's get started. It is 10 past, and we're going to look at intellectual property basics. First of all, big disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. My goodness, I'm not a lawyer. I've got some friends who are lawyers, and they have told me on several occasions, James, you are not a lawyer. So trust me when I say I'm not a lawyer. What I mean by this is that intellectual property law is massive and complex and varies from country to country. All I can do is give you my perspectives as a game designer in the UK specifically, who has worked with multiple licenses. Sometimes the license holders are overseas, but I operate under UK licensing law, and I can talk to you about that. I'm not aiming to give you a full comprehensive guide to how that works. There are people who are way more qualified than me to do that. What I'm trying to do is give you just a basic introduction to key terms and specifically how we use them in the context of creating licensed games. Mainly, I wanted to put this in so that I'm going to give you the terminology that I'll be using throughout the rest of the talk, so we're all on the same page. So hopefully this will all be nice and straightforward. First of all, let's cover this one off. What is intellectual property? Intellectual property is something that you create using your mind. So it could be a story, an invention, an artistic work, a symbol, a game, a novel, a piece of music, whatever it might be. If you created it under the law of the UK, certainly, and I imagine most other countries as well, you own it. Now, it could be possible that you can share that ownership, or you can sell it onto a new owner. So, for example, when I worked at Games Workshop designing games for them, as part of my contract, every piece of intellectual property that I created as part of that job became the property of Games Workshop by default. And that's a fairly standard thing for anyone working in a creative studio type environment. The main key thing is, though, that if you create a thing, which is an artistic or creative work, then you own it, and only you have the right to profit from it unless you give someone else that permission. When we're looking at intellectual property in the context of games, we are generally looking at stuff like novels, graphic novels, video games, TV shows, movies, existing tabletop games, anything that we are using to create. We're using it as the basis for a game that we're designing. So, for example, here, Hellboy and Devil May Cry, they're both things. Hellboy is a comic series, if you don't know it. Devil May Cry is a long-standing series of video games. We've made board game versions of both of those. The Expanse is a TV show, which designer Jeff Engelstein made a fantastic board game based on. There have been loads of games based on Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop, both created internally, and I worked on a few of those, and also externally. So there used to be a license with Fantasy Flight Games, who made loads of games based on that IP. The key thing is these are things where there's like a universe or a setting that is created, and we're making a game within that setting. What is a licensing agreement? So we know what an intellectual property is. What is a licensing agreement? So this is an agreement between the IP owner, so the person who's created that IP or who owns it as a result of having bought it from the creator. It's an agreement between them and a third party, another party which allows that party to do something with the IP which would otherwise infringe the IP holder's rights. So, for example, if I wrote a series of novels and then someone else made a game based on that series of novels and they sold it, they'd be infringing my rights as the IP holder unless we have a licensing agreement in place which defines me as the licensor, them as the licensee, and defines the terms for how that's going to work and how they can sell that to make a profit. Usually, this will have a fixed term. So anyone here who's a board game fan will know the horrible pain when a board games company which has a license, the license expires and that game no longer becomes available. Anyone here play Netrunner at all? Netrunner was one of my favorite card games, and that was Fantasy Flight Games, who had licensed the Android setting to create a card game with. They'd actually licensed the Netrunner mechanics, Netrunner being a game that came out in the 80s, and brought it into their own IP, which was at the Android setting, like a cyberpunk futuristic setting, and the rights expired, so the game stopped existing. Not quite, though, because it's kind of moved online. There's a whole thing there. But it's a thing that you see a lot in the board games world. Fantasy Flight and Games Workshop, their licensing agreement expired, and all of their games suddenly became very valuable on eBay. Battlestar Galactica is another example of a very well-loved game, which has recently been rethemed and reskinned to a different IP. but uses the same mechanics. So yeah, you'll normally have a fixed term. You'll also normally have, well, always pretty much, you'll have an agreement for some sort of revenue system, which usually breaks down into an upfront fee and ongoing royalties paid by the licensee to the licensor. So in the example I gave earlier, I've created a series of novels. Someone else is making a game based on that series of novels. I'm going to give them the right to do that. In exchange, they will give me money. And I will then profit from the thing through them. So it is usually split into an upfront fee, and then ongoing royalties based on a percentage of sales. And the higher one is, the lower the other usually is. So with smaller game designers or publishers, you might find they will try to push for a low upfront fee so that they can afford the license in the first place. But that means they have to pay a higher royalty ongoing. So a licensing agreement is a very key part of adapting a game. Here's a question. Why should you base your game on an existing property? Sounds like a potentially obvious question, but let's run through it anyway. There are several advantages. So first of all, you've got a ready-made theme for your game. Part of the fun of designing a board game is establishing a theme, by which I mean the setting, the artwork, all of that sort of stuff. If you make your game based off your own ideas, your own intellectual property, it can be difficult sometimes to choose what that theme should be. With an existing IP, you've already got all that stuff kind of laid out for you, as well as often some guidance on what sort of game it should be. If, for example, you're making a game based on a movie about, I don't know, dogfighting planes in World War II, you're probably going to make a game that's some kind of dogfighting, Wings of Glory, X-Wing style miniatures game, right? Because that's the most obvious thing. Doesn't mean it has to be that, of course. You could make a game which zooms out and looks at the logistics of running an air corps. We'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, so you get a load of guidance for what your game should look like, feel like, and maybe what the mechanics should be. You get a reach beyond your audience. If you're an established game designer, you probably have an audience, or even if you're someone who's just coming in new to it, you maybe haven't got an audience yet. Having an IP means you've got their fan base who will want to come and play your game. When we did Hellboy with Mantic Games, we had a whole load of people coming in who were massive fans of the comic, who just wanted it because they like Hellboy. Guillermo del Toro, who made the first two Hellboy movies, he has a copy. He's probably got no interest in playing the game, but he wants it as a piece of like Hellboy memorabilia. So it's important that you recognize the fact you're going to get an audience beyond it. And I'll talk in a little bit about why that introduces some potential problems. Again, you get brand recognition. It's kind of the same sort of thing. People will see a game, they'll go, "Oh, hey, that's a game based on that TV show I like. I want to go and get that." It gives you some prestige, and it makes you look like potentially a bigger player than you actually are. And finally, it gives you access to a library of assets. One of the biggest costs when you create a game is creating original artwork, illustrations, graphic design elements, that kind of thing. And if you get a visually oriented IP, so for example, Hellboy is a great example. There's 25 years worth of comics. We had access to that entire library of comics, so all the cards are covered in art from the comics, and it really reduced the amount of new artwork that needed to be created for it. So there are loads and loads of good reasons for why you should do this. However, of course, there are some challenges. Getting a licensing agreement in the first place with an IP holder will not be free and probably won't be cheap. To give you an idea, I mean, you're generally looking in the tens of thousands of pounds for a sort of standard level, like decent IP that you might want to get hold of. If it's something smaller, that might not be an issue. For example, we've been designing a game based on a series of independent comics. It's a role-playing game. We're having a great time with that, and it's through some people we know. We have a licensing agreement with them, but it's a much smaller scale than like a large commercial IP, so it's a bit different. But yeah, you're looking generally in quite a lot of money up front, as well as a decent slice of takings down the line. And the thing is, if anyone here has any experience or knowledge about creating board games professionally, commercially for sale, margins are quite thin anyway. So by taking on a license, you're gambling, because if it doesn't do well, you've still got to pay your fees to the license holder, and your tiny margins get even tinier. And that can really hurt. What you're hoping for, the reason you're making that gamble, is you're hoping that the additional recognition and the additional fan base you get will give you quantity of sales, so that your game will be successful and you'll give money back to the IP holder. There are legal hoops to jump through, of course. We'll talk a little bit about the sort of things that go into a licensing agreement, but there's generally a lot going on in there. You'll have, excuse me, if you've got experience working in the board games world, things are quite loosey-goosey around here. By which I mean, it's generally quite a sort of cottage industry. Everyone's kind of in it for the fun. We're all kind of hobbyists and gamers. We all like each other's stuff. The moment you start looking at like a Hollywood IP, or a AAA studio video game IP, they have expectations that are nothing like the board games world has. They will have all sorts of things you have to do to get things right. There'll be massive, in multiple approval stages. You need to get sign-offs from so many different stakeholders, and it can really be an eye-opener. It can. I've seen it disillusion a lot of new game designers who have managed to get hold of a license. Excuse me, sorry. Getting an IP holder to trust you is not easy. You need to often kind of prove your credentials. You need to be able to say, look, I am someone who is a capable designer. I'm going to be able to do a professional job that showcases your IP well. I can market it, I can sell it. And also, I know your IP. A lot of the time, an IP holder won't be interested in talking to you if they think you're just trying to make a quick buck and you don't know what makes their IP what it is. Again, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. You might encounter artificial design limitations, by which I mean things that the IP holder wants. Basically, you're entering into a creative partnership at this point, and you might find halfway through the process that actually the person who owns the IP really wants X to be in their board game. They've got a favorite character who they really like in their thing they've created, and they don't understand why you haven't included them in there. You might have a really good reason for not having done so, but they want them in there. And so you have to kind of manage different people's expectations and deal with limitations you otherwise wouldn't have to. And of course, those expectations come from the fan base as well. When I worked on Blood Bowl for Games Workshop, which is technically a licensed game in that it's not a licensed game, it's working with an existing property. So it wasn't licensed, there wasn't a licensing agreement, but it was adapting an existing Games Workshop property. There was a huge fan base for that because the game itself had been around for a long time. And there were points at which, torches and pitchforks were definitely wielded in my direction on a number of occasions. But it's similar with everything else. I mean, with Hellboy, there's one character in the Hellboy board game who doesn't quite work as he does in the comics. And it's one of my biggest regrets that I didn't quite get it right. But the fan base, they let me know very quickly that was the case. So yeah, you have to kind of be ready to take a lot of feedback on board. And the challenges can be pretty big, but the benefits can be really, really cool when you work with an existing IP. So yeah, just in summary of that, the most important thing to take away from that section is you can't profit from a game based on someone else's IP unless you have a licensing agreement. You can create a game based on someone else's IP, you just can't profit from it. So if you go online, you will see loads of like fan reskins of games. Love Letter is a game that gets reskinned all the time. You'll see I think a lot of them are actually for sale these days, but I've seen Batman Love Letter, Game of Thrones Love Letter, various animes in Love Letter form. If you're not familiar, Love Letters are like a 9-card game, or there's 9 designs of card. So it's very easy to reskin it. As long as those are made available online, generally, most places will not tell you to take it down. Not always the case. I believe Disney is quite big on shutting down anything which looks like it might be trying to make a professional looking product, even if there's not a profit involved. But basically, the main rule is if you're not profiting, so if you want to profit from a thing, you must have a licensing agreement. And as I said, licensing an IP has loads of benefits, but it's not easy or cheap. The point of this talk, though, is we're going to try to talk about some things to help you overcome those barriers and make it easier for you. So stick around, and hopefully it will be this will be valuable or useful to you. Before I move on, are there any questions about that section at all? If you have questions about broader topics, save them for the end. But if you have questions specifically about that kind of introductory chunk, drop them in the chat now, and I will answer away. I'm just going to mute the microphone so I can have a nice cough, because apparently COVID hasn't quite completely left me yet. There we go. I'm slightly regretting not having a bigger glass of water. This could get interesting. We might have to have a little break halfway through so I can go off and grab another one. Right. I can see a question impending. There's someone typing. By the way, if any questions come up during the section and you want to ask them at the end, feel free to throw them into the chat midway. I will do my very best not to get distracted and stay on topic, and I'll answer them at the end. At what stage of the design process should you approach the IP owner? That's a fantastic question. It depends. If you have your heart set on an IP and you really want to create a game that is, based on that IP, I would recommend, if you've got no prior track record of working with the IP holder, I would create like a vertical slice demo, we would call it. Anyone who's been on our game design course, this will be like a test build. That's Game Design Online, talk about that later. But a test build is like it's like a couple of rounds of gameplay. Very simple, like 10 minutes. Hasn't got to be too flashy. Just something to show that you understand what the IP is and here's how you would translate it to a game. Then go and talk to the IP holder. Now, the more clout you can get, the better. So if you can show that you've adapted games before, that you've been designing games for however many years, if you've got a track record of putting games out to the public, or you've got connections, whatever else, that's all stuff that's going to help you. What you don't want to do is spend a load of time working on a game and showing it to them, at the end, once you've spent a year working on it, only for them to say, actually, no, we're not interested, or no, we're already developing a game in-house, we're working with someone else. So it's kind of, there's a balancing act. Don't do it right at the start. Don't do it right at the end. You want to kind of have done enough to show that you know what you're doing. But the more clout you've got, the earlier you can go, if that makes sense. How would you reach out to an IP holder? The next section will tell you about that. But in short, use a lawyer. Yes, definitely get a lawyer involved. If you want to work with IPs, you need to have a lawyer. So let's talk about the licensing process in a bit more detail. This is something where every situation will be different. Every project, every client, every IP is unique. We've worked with IP holders where the licensing department is this vast, monolithic, huge group, and you have to kind of speak to various people within that. We've also worked with ones where it's just like one person in a cupboard, who is the guardian of the IP, and they just want people to make games based on their stuff. And everything on that spectrum exists. So this section is basically looking to just show you what goes into obtaining a license and using it to make a game, and walk you through a default process. But as I say, it will vary from case to case. So how do you obtain a license? As I say, you need to approach the IP holder with a pitch. That pitch could be a case of use of having a short video prepared, which is you showing off how much you like their license or their IP, how much you have wanted to make a game for it for a while, and you showing the game that you've made. Again, you're keeping it very small and you're just showing them maybe 5 minutes of play. It could be that you reach out to them at a licensing show. There are shows you can go to with large licensing events which often happen at like convention centers, and you go along and there'll be loads of license holders and brands and things, and you can kind of speak to them face to face and say, hey, I'm a game designer, I'd love to make a game based on your IP, what goes into that, and kind of start having that conversation. A lot of the time they will want to work with people because they're getting money out of it, right? If they own an IP, companies make a lot of money out of IPs. When Games Workshop had a really successful year, when would that have been? About 2016, 2017? It was when their stock suddenly skyrocketed. It was just when I left, just before my share save scheme matured. So I missed out on a large chunk of money. But point is, they had a really profitable year. Lots of people attributed it to the Warhammer community stuff that came out. They did a load of stuff online. If you looked at the investor reports, a huge proportion of it came from Warhammer Total War and Vermintide, which were 2 licensed video games. So even though Games Workshop itself was being very successful, they made way more money just from licensing out their IPs. So IP holders often will want to make their properties available for people to use, but they also don't want their brand to be something that is subpar. So they will want to kind of get some proof that you are, you're decent at what you do. So as I said a minute ago, you'll need to kind of prove your credentials maybe in various different fields. Also, the larger the IP is, the larger the company holding it, the more effort you'll have to maybe put in. When you get smaller IPs, so for example, creator-owned IPs, so comics, novels, things that are maybe a bit more on the indie side, you can probably just approach them directly and talk to them. The more corporate it gets, the more hoops you'll have to jump through. And it often helps to investigate a specific IP manager or licensing manager within the company rather than use a general inquiries email. So, for example, if you wanted to make a license of a video game from, I don't know, Square Enix, rather than directly contacting the Square Enix general inquiries line, it would do you well to maybe look on LinkedIn and look at Square Enix and see if you can find a licensing manager and see if you can find an email address. Ask around, find people, find connections in the tabletop games industry, and ask them if they've got contacts that you can talk to within that industry. One of the big things that we always tell people when they're getting into game design is get to know other game designers, because it is a small industry and networking is really important. The line between networking and nepotism is always a blurry one, but definitely you can get a lot further by being a skilled, proficient person who knows people than just by being a skilled, proficient person. So yeah, find out who it is you need to talk to, approach them, and just try to make yourself look good, make yourself look professional, show off the things you've done, have a portfolio, be able to say, these are games I've designed, even if none of them have been released commercially, saying, look, I'm really passionate about your game and I want my first game design to be one based on your IP. What I will say though, is if you want to go down that route, a small license is definitely better. Being able to approach, I don't know, an indie artist or something who's maybe done a series of art prints within a particular universe and you want to create a game based on that, you can probably, go to them and say, hey, look, I've not actually published a game before, but I love your work. I'd love to make a game based on it. They'll probably be quite amenable to that. If it's a large company, you might want to be able to say to them, well, I've actually created a small licensed game before, so I've been through the process of crowdfunding and publishing, whatever else. I have a track record. They will probably want to see that. So yeah, make sure you can kind of slam your credentials on the table when you do speak to the IP man, the licensing manager, or whoever it is. And of course, you'll need to make a licensing agreement. Now, if they have an established licensing team or something, they'll have probably standard forms they use for this stuff. Again, you will need to have a lawyer to go through and check everything. But here are the things you will generally see, and this is not exhaustive, but these are the most important things you'll see in a licensing agreement. First of all is the term, how long it will last and what happens when it ends. Sometimes, if you're, say you're publishing a game, you're selling it yourself, if it's based on an IP, when that agreement ends, the agreement might state that you have to stop selling that game. It might say you have to stop producing that game. You can't make any more, but you can sell through the stock you've already got. It might say you have to kind of, I don't know, destroy all the copies that exist at that point. Who knows? The important thing is you need to make sure you know what happens when that term runs out. Revenue. So how much is the upfront fee? What are the ongoing royalties? All of this is stuff you should negotiate. I would never recommend taking the first thing they offer. I mean, you don't want to be appalling about it, but at the same time, you should make sure you're getting something that is valuable to you and is worth your time. So don't let them rinse you on the revenues. The next one is one people don't often think about, the specifics of the IP. So Games Workshop is a great example here because they have a huge amount of intellectual property. I would say that Games Workshop's IP is its most valuable asset. Not just because it brings in a load of money from licensing, but because it is so big, so recognizable, so iconic, and everything they do comes back to it. All the miniatures, all the games comes back to their IP. When they license things out now, they specifically license out particular products, or at least they did when I was there about 5 years ago. So they would say, right, you can go and make a video game based on this box product. I did a game for them called The Horus Heresy Betrayal at Calth, and they did a video game based specifically on that. So it was limited. So the video game designers were limited to just what was in that box. If they wanted to have anything outside of that, they had to specifically agree that with Games Workshop beforehand. So yeah, bear in mind, there might be specific parts of the IP that you're allowed. When we did the Hellboy board game, the licensing agreement there was very open. There's 25 years of Mignola-verse comics. Go crazy. Do whatever you like. So we could literally contact Dark Horse and say, we need panel 6 of page 7 of this comic from 1999, whatever, and that was just fine. We didn't have to query it. It was available to us for us to put in the game, which was great. With Devil May Cry, we were specifically doing Devil May Cry 5, which was fun because Devil May Cry 5 wasn't announced until we were about 3/4 of the way through the project. So we found out at that point there was a new game coming out. So we had to pivot it to incorporate that, because we'd previously been basing on Devil May Cry 4. So yeah, always make sure your agreement tells you exactly which parts of the IP you can and can't use. Approvals. This is massive. I'm going to talk about approvals a little bit more in a little bit, but the licensor will want to have some say in the game. How much say they want to have will vary, but at a bare minimum, they're going to need to approve of the final thing. So you need to make sure your agreement covers the points at which they can have input, when they can give feedback, how approvals will work. Marketing is worth covering off. How much will the licensor help promote the game? If you make a game based off of, I don't know, a big Halo, from Bungie and Microsoft. If you make that, will Bungie and Microsoft go and promote your game when it comes out? It would be great to know that in advance, because you can plan your own marketing accordingly. One other thing I didn't mention under specifics is, are you allowed to use iconography, graphics, illustrations from the source IP, or do you need to create your own? If you look at, there was a little rash a few years ago of board games based on the TV series Firefly, and several of them used illustrations rather than images from the show, because they had the rights to the characters but not to the actors' likenesses, I believe. You often see this as well in like the recent Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy video games, where they didn't have the actors' likeness rights, so they had to create their own versions of the characters, not based on the actors. So yeah, all those little specific details. A lawyer will definitely be the thing, especially you want to get a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property. And I've met a few of them, and they're very sharp people, and they're very useful people to have, and they often don't come cheap. So let's talk about approvals. So as I say, they will want to have some kind of input on the design process at various points. You really need to establish upfront how that will work. You don't want to kind of go into it thinking it's going to be a fairly easygoing arrangement and then have them on the phone every week saying, why haven't you sent us your updated rules, whatever it is. Some licensors don't care, especially if they don't know much about board games. They'll just want to make sure that you're not putting anything out that is directly contradictory with the IP. They'll care about how it looks. They won't necessarily care about mechanics. Other license holders will be very specific about making sure that everything you do is on brand, and they'll want to be involved as much as possible. Make sure you know which one you're dealing with up front. You will generally need to go through multiple approval stages. We recommend this anyway. If anyone's been on Games On Online or has looked at how we design games generally, looked at our website and things, you'll know that we do things in stages. So we will start off with a basic idea of a game, like a small little vertical slice, and then gradually build outwards from there. A big part of the reason why we work that way is because we work with a lot of license holders. We need to make sure that they can give approval at various stages. So they will initially approve the basic direction of the game, and then they'll gradually approve the other things we fold in as well. You need to get, though, a process for these approvals, because one thing I will say is they will add quite a lot of time to a project. So if you've got a set delivery date, if you say, well, I want to run a Kickstarter for my game in September, so I need to have actual reviewers by late July or whatever it might be. That's cutting it a bit fine, if I'm honest with you. Then you need to make sure that you're counting approvals time in your design time, because it might take 2 or 3 weeks for approvals to come back to you. You can send it to your IP holders. They might have things going on internally, which means it gets delayed. So make sure you're nice and clear with that up front about how that works. Oh, that's another point as well. I mentioned Kickstarter. Make sure, if you want to use like a crowdfunding platform like Kickstarter or GameFound, Indiegogo, whatever it might be, you might need to approve that with your license holder. I know a few years ago, I know this anecdotally, so don't quote me on it, a large game which did very well on Kickstarter, and it's based on a popular film franchise. Halfway through the Kickstarter campaign, the license holder realized there was a Kickstarter campaign happening. They hadn't been told, and tried to shut it down because they didn't want their IP having anything on Kickstarter for whatever reason. And at this point, it had made a significant chunk of money. So a large, awkward conversation began between the licensor and the licensee, trying to figure out what they would do. And in the end, they went ahead with it. But it was pretty hairy for a while there. So make sure you cover all that sort of stuff off. The last point there is actually a really it's a really important one. Make sure you have an approvals process, including a process for dealing with changes to things that have already been approved. Because I guarantee, if you have a process where you say, we will design a thing, we'll pass it to you for approval. Once you've given it the thumbs up, we'll move on to the next thing. There will come a point a little way down the line where someone in the, someone either in the company that owns the IP or whatever, they will say, oh, actually, we don't like that. I know we approved it, but we don't like it. You have to have a process for what to do in that case. If you have an agreement up front before any approvals are made, where you say changes made after approval on things that have been approved will incur a cost of this much, then they can make the call on whether they care enough to pay that money. And if they do, fantastic, you get some extra money for it. If they don't, then they will learn to be better at approving things in future. It sounds harsh, but it has to go both ways. If you get something approved, you have to know that you're able to move on. It is possible to design games for a publisher who has a licensing agreement. This is probably a better way to get started working on licensing or licensed games. This is what we've done for most of the time. Is we, for example, with Hellboy, we worked with Mantic Games, who had the licensing agreement with Dark Horse Comics, which owns the IP. So that meant that we didn't have to go through quite so many legal hoops. We just had an agreement with Mantic Games to create a game, and they were responsible for dealing with the licensor completely. If you get an agreement like that, though, it's worth finding out whether you have direct access to the licensor. And if you don't, be ready for slippage. What I mean by that is you will ask a question of your publishing partner or whoever it is, your intermediary. They will then pass that question on to the license holder, who will give an answer back. And it's like you're playing the telephone game. Things can kind of take extra time, or they can be miscommunicated or whatever else. For me, the agreement, the situations like this that I prefer are where, even if we're using an intermediary, we have access to the license holder and we can talk to them, ask them questions, and get their take on things. So yeah, it's a possibility, but it brings added complexity. And of course, one thing it does is it brings in additional stakeholders. You can end up with lots of different stakeholders. A stakeholder being someone who holds a stake in the game, so someone who stands to profit from it or has an interest in it in some way. They might all have different ideas for what the game should be. So, for example, when it came to, I'm going to use Hellboy again because it's a great example. Dark Horse Comics. So the team at Dark Horse Comics, the licensing team, they had their opinions. We had Mike Mignola, who is the overall owner. He was able to he had like a veto right on anything we did. We had the team at Mantic Games, who had their ideas. And we had the ideas that we wanted to do for the game. So we had certain things that we did and didn't want to include. All these different people might have different ideas for what they want the game to be, because they'll have different reasons for wanting to do it. Party A wants to make a profit. Party B wants to showcase this cool IP. Party C just likes games. Party D really enjoys this one particular part of the IP and doesn't care what happens as long as that goes in. You need to make sure you set out clear aims for what the project is going to be before any agreements are signed. That should ideally be a part of the agreement or an appendix attached to the agreement. What are you making and why? And you can use that to create a comprehensive design brief, which you can go back to whenever you need to resolve a dispute. And that, since we started doing that, it has solved so many headaches. If we'd done that from the start, I might still have hair, although it's doubtful. So in summary, you might need to prove yourself to a potential licensing partner. You need to make sure your licensing agreement is comprehensive and get a lawyer involved, and be ready. There may be challenges when it comes to approvals, but be strong. You will get through them. Right. Any questions? Got some questions here in the chat. Do I think that taking the design idea to a tabletop company who can then help you obtain the IP is a viable option? Yeah, as I said, an intermediary is definitely an option. We have worked with situations where we've been contacted by a license holder. So it's kind of back to front. They contacted us and we said, that's great, but we do not have the capacity in-house to publish games. We design games, but we do have a publishing partner we can work with. And we kind of looked, it ended up falling through, but we then went to that publisher and said, look, can you come and have an agreement with these people so we can make the game with you? So definitely, yeah, you can do that. And it is generally good to get in with a studio, whether it's a small, medium, large studio. Get yourself known by them so that if they get approached by a license holder and they want to make a game and they haven't got capacity in-house, they can come to you and get you to design it for them. So yeah, Dave, worked on an IP once, and the IP holders wanted 30% of the Kickstarter, which killed the whole thing in the end. Yep. Percentages like that, 30% is massive. That's a huge amount. So for example, if you're doing a Kickstarter with a funding goal of £50,000, let's say £50,000 for argument's sake, Kickstarter will take 10% of whatever you raise. Now I say it's not. It's I think Amazon takes 5 and Kickstarter gets 5 or something. It's you lose 10% through card charges and all that sort of stuff. So immediately you're losing 10% there. So you're down to 45,000. You will then it's 5. I think it's 5% for Kickstarter and 5% for Stripe or something. I forget. Whatever the case, you're losing a chunk there. You then lose a chunk on potentially taxes and things. You will lose various things. It comes down more and more and more, and then you have your production costs. And if you're having to pay 30% of your overall funding goal to the license holder, it can absolutely screw you, which is why it's really important to get an accountant involved before any kind of crowdfunding campaign, because you want to make sure that you're not missing anything. Getting an accountant who is knowledgeable about crowdfunding and manufacture of board games is utterly priceless, and I can't recommend it enough with any kind of crowdfunding campaign, let alone one which involves a license, because when there's a license involved, there are so many more little costs you'll have to think about. So it's not for the faint of heart, but hey, if you do it right, you can do very well. Any more questions on that section? I'm going to talk about some actual game design stuff next. It's been very businessy so far. I never came into this to be a business person. All I wanted to do was design games for a living. What I didn't realize was that would involve a lot of actual, not gamesy hard graft. But hey, I'm figuring it out one day at a time. So let's move on then. Let's talk about designing within an IP. How do you do it? So let's say you've made your approach, you've got your licensing agreement, you're able to make a game based on I don't know, whatever it is, Short Circuit, the movie from the 80s. You can now make your Short Circuit board game. What do you do? Where do you start? First thing I'll say is please don't just slap an IP onto an existing game that you've already designed and call it a day. You can make a profit that way. I know of several publishers that do this quite successfully. I feel like it's creatively bankrupt, and once you've done it a couple of times, your customer base will recognize that for what it is, and they will be unwilling to follow you and invest in your future things that you're interested in doing. What you really need to do, the key to a good licensed game, is to identify the iconic elements within that IP and build a game around them. You don't need to encompass the entire IP, as it says there. One of the things that I think we have got a good track record of, when we make a game based on an IP, we often see in reviews, because we read our own reviews because we're fools. Don't read your own reviews, although you probably should, because you want to see where you're going wrong and then course correct. But one of the things that I see repeatedly in reviews is this game feels like the source material. The Devil May Cry board game, there were a lot of challenges in adapting that for the tabletop, because it's a single player, very intricate, high skill game. It's a game where there's a lot of skill in hitting the right buttons in the right order to do big combos and kill lots of bad guys in a stylish way. Trying to translate that to the tabletop was difficult, because you don't have things like quick reflexes or precise button inputs. But because we focused on creating cool combos and that sort of thing, people felt when they played it that it felt like Devil May Cry. So you need to be clever. You need to not just try to do the entire thing and call it a day. You need to zoom in and figure out what makes the IP tick. So step one is to determine the scope of your game. As I said already, you might not have access to the entire IP. If you're creating a board game based on Star Wars, let's say that Fantasy Flight has lost the license somehow, or Asmodee rather has lost the license somehow, and you're creating a Star Wars board game, you might not have access to the whole of Star Wars. You might not be able to do Ewoks Caravan of Courage, the resource management game, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that. But even if you do have access to the entire IP, you don't have to use it all. And in fact, zooming in on one particular area can really focus your design. So can zooming out. You can find, so say, for example, if you were doing a Star Wars IP, if you were given free reign of Star Wars, you could say, well, I'm going to do a game. If you look at any Star Wars game, they're all quite specific. So Star Wars Rebellion is a 2-player game which focuses on the concept of the rebellion hiding from the Empire, because that's the thing that comes up a few times in the films. The rebellion are on the back foot. They're fighting a guerrilla war. They are doing their best to stay out of the Empire's way. I mean, in the original trilogy, on at least 2 occasions, the main plot point is the rebel base has been discovered. And so that's like a key part of the IP. So they focused on that thing. Compare it to Imperial Assault, which is all about small bands of, plucky heroes going into Empire bases and completing missions, which again, it's a key part of the IP, but they're not trying to do the whole of Star Wars in one go. Also, of course, if you do a nice zoomed in, focused game based on an IP and it goes well, hey, that license holder might be interested in you doing another game based on something else in the same setting. The examples I've written down here: Hellboy, 25 years worth of comics. We initially started on the first few, so the core game is based on the first few comics, with a few little adjustments here and there. I'll talk a little bit later about how to adjust and kind of be clever and bend the rules a little bit. Devil May Cry, we ignored the storyline, because Devil May Cry has this elaborate story, and it would have been very easy to try kind of make a dungeon crawler game, like a game where you play the 4 characters that we ended up choosing, and you go through a series of levels and you beat up bad guys and you follow a storyline. We decided not to do that. We decided to focus on the kind of stylish combat element, and I think that surprised quite a few people, and it reviewed quite well as a result. I think it made it stand out. Whenever I did a game for Games Workshop, when I was working internally there, and also Blitzball, which I did it externally for Games Workshop, each one of those was based on a very specific thing. Gore Chosen was a 2 to 4 player arena combat game, very quick, very simple, based specifically on 4 characters from one faction, and the idea of them in a pit fight, having to go at each other with swords and axes and whatever else. One of them swings an anvil on a chain because it's Games Workshop and that sort of thing flies. In each case, we were never trying to encompass the whole of an IP. The more you focus, the easier your life will be. It is your duty, though, when you're designing a game based on an existing IP, to get really good at it. I read a quote from a journalist, and I forget who it was. I should have looked this up really beforehand, shouldn't I? But it was a quote from a journalist who said, when you're researching a story, for the duration of that research period, you become the world expert on that topic. In an ideal world, if you're doing a good job, you become the person who knows the absolute most there is to know about that topic, whatever it might be. And the moment you send it to your editor and it gets published, you just forget it and move on to the next thing. And that's kind of how we approach the IPs that we make games based on. You need to become an expert in your chosen IP. For Hellboy, I read 25 years worth of comics across multiple lines. I got access to Dark Horse Digital, special login, which gave me digital downloads for everything. And I sat on my tablet. Whenever I wanted to sit and read something for about 6 months, I just read one of those comics. And I'm quite a fast reader, but it still took a long time. And for that period, I knew Hellboy inside out. Ask me now about it, and my memory is fairly hazy. But at the time, I had loads of notes. I had all sorts of things I was going through and thinking, oh, that'd be a cool panel to use in the game for an item. That'd be a cool character to include. That'd be a cool little reference to throw in. If you don't know the IP well, if you're going in kind of with a complete blank slate and you don't know much about it, my first question will be, well, why are you trying to make a game out of it? Is it because it's popular and will sell well? Is it because it's available as a license? Okay, cool, but you owe it to the fan base, to the IP holders, to yourself to go and learn it and to go and do some research. Now, research is, there are different ways of doing it. So you can sit and read 25 years worth of comics. You can use secondary sources. So, for example, I don't know if I can say this. I might cut this out of the recorded version that goes out, or I might not. When I was at Games Workshop, there was no kind of central resource for all of the IP and background that exists. And there's a lot of it, as I've said. And so I used to use Lexicanum, which is an online wiki that was used by people. The fans would kind of create it and annotate it with all sorts of things. The important thing was, though, I'd never use that as my primary source. I'd use that as a secondary source because I'd look up, a particular hive fleet that was in the setting, and it was quite good at footnotes and referencing, like in Wikipedia. So I would go, which planets has it attacked? It would say these ones, footnote, as explained in this publication. So I'd then be able to go back to our big library, our big wall of books, get that publication out and read the primary source the information came from. So don't rely on the internet. There's an example of that going horribly wrong in a game called Rising Sun. I think it was Rising Sun, made by Call Me or Not, designed by Eric M. Lang, where there were various mythical creatures, and one of the creatures that was included was taken from a Wikipedia page, and it had been edited in as a joke by someone who'd renamed some I think it was some Indonesian, or I want to say, mythical creature, and he'd included it, and it was just the name of his friend, and it was, it's a big hairy smelly beast, and it got used in the game, and there was a bit of a furore about it. There was I'll put the link up in Discord later, but because the creative team looked on the Wikipedia page for mythical creatures from this period, they found that because it was a little rarely used Wikipedia page. It had been edited a while back and no one had noticed that this was wrong. And they put it into the game and people were quite upset. So beware secondary sources. Always go to the primary source if you can. What really helps is to build a little network of playtesters, proofreaders, just people who are fans of the IP. If you're making that game based on Star Wars Caravan of Courage, find people who really love Star Wars Caravan of Courage and get them to come and play your game. And have people, we're not doing Hellboy, I have people who are who run websites in it, and I'd message them a question and say, hey, is there a character who does this thing? Does it feel appropriate for this character to do this in the game? All of that sort of stuff. So if you can't be an expert, surround yourself with experts. Here's the really key thing, though. To make a good licensed game, you need to identify the iconic elements of the property you're working within. The characters, settings, storylines, themes, emotions that really make that IP what it is. And the way to find out if something is iconic is, if you were to remove it, would the IP still feel like the IP? So let's talk about Star Wars. I'm sorry if there are people here who don't know what Star Wars is, but I'm just impressed that you exist, because it's quite a cultural juggernaut at this point. In pretty much any Star Wars thing, there's the Empire or something like it. So some kind of big, totalitarian governing body which uses stormtroopers or something like them. There'll be the Force and Jedis and lightsabers and all those sorts of things. And you look at pretty much any Star Wars licensed product, it will include those things in some way. If you were to remove Jedi from Star Wars, I mean, arguably, you look at things like there was the Mandalorian. Initially had no Jedi elements at all, and then they were brought in because it's Star Wars. You need to have Jedi and the Force, whatever else. So the question is, if you take those things out, does it still feel like the IP? And if not, you've identified a core iconic element. The licensor that you're working with might have specific things they really want you to include. And that's another, if they're saying that, it's probably because it's iconic, but also it might be that they've got particular things they want you to include. The key thing is, at the start of the project, make a big list of the things that need to be in there, whether because they are iconic or because you've been told you must include this stuff. Once you've done that, take your list of iconic elements and study them. The themes. So again, Star Wars, you might have themes of hope and rebellion and not giving up and all that sort of stuff. What kind of game does that recommend to you? I'm not going to go into huge details here about how to take a set of ideas and turn it into a game. Again, we do a 6-part course. We're kicking off a new 6 weeks next week, in fact, called Games On Online, and that is going to talk about how to take ideas and turn them into a game. But your iconic elements are the starting point for your game. Are they suggesting particular mechanics, particular type of game? It doesn't need to be the obvious choice. Just because Star Wars is all about Jedi and whatever else, the iconic, your first thought doesn't have to be, let's make a game about lightsaber dueling, because there's much more to it. But as long as the subject of your game comes out of those iconic elements, it will feel like that IP. And this is what I was saying earlier. Don't just slap an IP on something that exists already. If you've got a game that you've been working on for a while and an IP comes up and you go, actually, I'm going to take this arena combat game and take Jason the Wheeled Warriors and slap it on top of it. And this faction is now Sawboss and all the plant vehicles and things. And this one is Jason the Wheeled Warriors, and I really want to make a Jason the Wheeled Warriors game. You get that. It might look like it, and you might have some rules and mechanics which kind of feel like it, but at the core, if the game didn't grow out of that, it will not feel like it is made with that setting in mind. Once you've kind of got all of that, create a design brief. Again, we talk about design briefs in other seminars, but create a design brief. Be very clear about which iconic elements you're trying to evoke in your design. Once you've done that, once you start the actual design process, come back and review regularly. We always talk about the importance of iterative design and constant reviews within the design process, but you want to be looking at this brief specifically here to ask yourself if those iconic elements are present in your game. If you've got a game, you've identified. So in Hellboy, one of the things we realized was slow burn investigation and big punchy climaxes. That was kind of that was like the thing for us, was the game should feel like you're picking apart a mystery, you're gradually picking up clues and following a twisty turny storyline, and it all ends in a big punch up. And so the question was, does this game feel like this? And at various points during development, which was a long development for that game, we would say no, it's not right, take it back. Anyone who's played the Hellboy board game, we have a thing called the Impending Doom track, which has got 12 spaces on it, and it's because we wanted to have that kind of feeling of tension, of things building, and so each round it ticks along a certain amount, and the players have the option to kind of tick it along further in order to recover a bit and take a break. Early on, it was a clock face because we wanted the idea of time against you, and more stuff kind of worked into this clock face. And we realized one point we sat down and had a playtest. We were like, hang on, Hellboy isn't about clocks. why is this big clock face such an iconic thing? I think it was when we tried to find visual assets from the comic series that would work, and we found like one digital clock in one comic somewhere, and other than that there were no clock faces in Hellboy at all. Whether it's because Mike Mignola doesn't like drawing clock faces or whatever, we don't know. The point was, we had made this game all about this thing, and it was not an iconic element. It was a fun gameplay idea, but it didn't feel like Hellboy. And so we stripped a load of it out. The fact that the track is still 12 spaces is a throwback to that. It's why it has 12 spaces. But everything else kind of got stripped out and repurposed. So review regularly and do it before you seek approval from the licensor. When you don't want to hand something over for an approval if you haven't double checked that it's appropriate for the game, because they'll come back to you and go, hey, why have you made it all about clocks, or whatever it might be. You want to make sure they are always happy with what you're doing and they think you know what you're doing. So make sure you're checking it for yourself first. A good exercise is to strip the IP from your game. It takes a bit of time, but if you can kind of take all of the recognizable elements out of your game and use, like, go into Google Images and use placeholders for all the artwork, whatever else, change all the names, give it to your testers and ask them during feedback, does it feel like any particular, I don't know, books, novels, video games, TV shows, whatever it might be? Ask them that. We did this with Devil May Cry because the reason for doing it, actually, and how we discovered this as a good exercise, was we were not allowed to show anything about the game to any of our playtesters. We had to playtest the mechanics only without the IP attached, which was challenging because, of course, a lot of it was, we were trying to make it really feel like Devil May Cry. And so we stripped it all out and we made it a game about pirates and zombies. There were pirates who had, because we thought, well, we need people that have got melee attacks and pistols and things. Yeah, pirates, why not? And so we had all different pirate characters, 4 different ones, and we rethemed the entire game. There were various zombie monster things that were the Devil May Cry monsters that we had at the time. And we gave it to the testers, and one person came up to us at the end and said, you know what, this feels an awful lot like Devil May Cry. Have you considered trying to get a license for it? We were like, oh, that's some very interesting feedback. Thank you very much for that. And we knew we were on the right track. So we've done that again since with testers. We've given them a de-IP'd version of the game to see what they think of it and see if it makes them think of that. One other thing is, on that second point, whether iconic elements are present in your game, no is a valid answer. You can make a game about Jaws that doesn't have sharks in it. I mean, you'd be crazy to, but as long as it's a deliberate choice and you've managed to get agreement with the license holder, maybe Jaws, you've made a game all about, I don't know, male bonding in fraught situations and you've ditched the sharks. I don't think it'll sell very well, but it's a valid option as long as your license holder agrees. The important thing, like any element of your design brief, the important thing is to do it consciously. So in summary, you don't need to use the whole IP. You can pick and choose different bits and zoom in where necessary. But what's important is to identify the iconic elements and build your game around them. And then come back, review your game regularly to see if it evokes those elements. And if not, figure out why. So any questions on that, on designing within an IP? It's quite a big topic. If you have any questions, drop me the thing. I'm going to disappear for just 1 minute. I'm going to turn my camera off so you don't have to watch me getting up and leaving. I'm going to get some more water and I'll be right back. So if you've got any questions in the meantime, drop them in the chat. Okay, no questions, looks like. Someone typing. Are we having fun so far? Is it informative? Is it interesting? Are you learning things that you'd like to learn? I certainly hope so. There's not many questions coming in during the talk. I'm just going to assume that means that you're all wrapped and engrossed in the things I'm saying. It's a huge topic. I could probably do multiple seminars on this. This is kind of just designed as an overview of the process based on our experiences. Hopefully this is helpful to you. I've actually been thinking a lot about this recently because it's something that's very close to my heart. You know, I've seen a lot of good licensed games. I've seen a lot of bad licensed games, and I have strong opinions about what the difference is. So I think it was only really a matter of time before this talk happened. Right, what have we got left? So we are now at 8:10, and we've got we're doing good. We're actually on track. I'm actually hang on, reshaping it. I'm about 5 minutes ahead of where I planned to be. So that's great. We might actually get this finished by 9 o'clock, which would be beautiful. Cool. I'm going to jump on to the next topic. Here's a question. Hugh, thank you. What about the source material? What about if the source material is basically depressing? Okay, yeah, one where an oppressive or struggling feeling is an integral part of the experience. How do you evoke that negative vibe without making it unfun to play? That is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for that. So when I first started designing games, I would have said to you that every game has to be fun to play. But I now use the term engaging. I think that a game has to be engaging, and it has to provoke an emotional response from your players, whatever that is. The reason I say this, the thing that prompted this change in my attitude towards it, is over the past few years, several games have come out that I would not describe as fun, but I would describe as very engaging. The two that came out in particular, and I think it was 2018 or 2019, there were two games that came out. There was This War of Mine, which was based on a video game, very relevant right now, my goodness, which is about basically trying to live within a war zone. And it is one of the most upsetting video games I've ever played, and the board game captures that beautifully. For those that aren't aware, basically it's a colony, sort of, you've got a small group of people in a small, basically in a ruined house trying to survive, and it forces you to make decisions which will make you question your own humanity in order to keep your characters alive. And it's a beautiful game, and I would not say it's fun to play. I'd say it's stressful, and it makes you feel a lot of feelings. It's wonderful though. So, and the second example I was going to say, thank you, Gogo. The second example I was going to say was Holding on the Troubled Life of Billy Kerr, which I've not played it. I need to get around to playing it, but it's a game where basically it deals with a terminal patient in a hospice, and you're playing the hospice staff trying to piece together his life and help him resolve various things. That's not fun. It's a game that you come out of feeling, from what I've heard, you feel emotional. You feel proper emotion throughout the entire thing. So yeah, I don't think that a game has to be fun necessarily to be worthwhile. That's not to say that you can't do it. So if you have a source material which is all about something quite dark or something quite depressing, something which is, oppressive potentially, can you find fun in that? Maybe. But what I would say is go back to your iconic elements. If an iconic element of the game is that or of the IP, say it's a piece of source material, it's a film or something, and one of the key things that people say about it is, well, it makes you feel really depressed, then maybe your game should evoke that same feeling. And the question is, if you remove that, will it still feel true to the IP? And if not, maybe it's not the right thing for you to be adapting. And maybe at that point, it's worth sort of considering whether it can be adapted. For example, I wouldn't want to make a board game based on, I don't know, Grave of the Fireflies. That's a film which I don't need to watch again because it nearly killed me the first time. Key point is, to me, a game has to be engaging. That doesn't necessarily mean fun. And there is definitely an increasing audience for games that make you think. It's worth looking at other media as well. So role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games. There's been a huge movement in the past few years towards games which evoke a lot of feelings. And there's a whole movement of games which are designed to evoke feelings as you read them. So look up lyric games, where they're kind of the intention is they are the role-playing game equivalent of a piece of poetry, and they're designed to make you feel feelings. And a lot of the time, they're not designed to even be played. They're designed to exist and to make you feel a certain way and capture a certain emotion. And I think, there's a whole load of scope for interesting corners of gaming to be explored at the moment. So don't limit yourself to just what is fun, I would say. God, this got deep, didn't it? Let's move on, shall we? So next, let's talk about what happens when there are elements of an IP that are not ideal for your game, because this is a thing that will happen. Because an IP is generally not written with a game adaptation in mind. Not always the case. Famously, The Expanse started out as a setting for a role-playing game, which I love. I love that's the case. Mainly because I know several people who have written comprehensive settings for their role-playing games and have said, oh, one day I'm going to turn this into a novel. And they never have. But the writer of The Expanse did that. And I think that's fantastic. But generally, you will not be that lucky. And you will not find an IP that's been written with a game adaptation in mind. The trap you can very easily fall into is being utterly slavish to your source IP and trying to replicate it at the expense of gameplay. The fact is, any adaptation kind of comes with an expectation that you're going to change some things. So you do have options for adapting it to suit your purposes. When Peter Jackson made the Lord of the Rings movies, no one expected him to, have every page completely faithfully recreated. As it says here, no adaptation from one medium to another is a one-to-one process. Peter Jackson wisely made the decision to remove most of the song in Tom Bombadil. Some people were very upset about that. I think it's probably the right move. Whatever the case, when you change something from one medium to another, you'll have to make compromises. You always want to stay faithful to the source material. And again, those iconic elements will be your guiding light in that case. But there are ways to sidestep some issues if you hit trouble. The amount of flexibility you have in that regard will very much depend on the licensor and your licensing agreement. So check this stuff out before you, you take the plunge and sign the agreement. Ask how much flexibility you've got, how much wiggle room you've got to make changes. But let's look at some sneaky strategies for reshaping an IP ever so slightly. So the vague brush. I love to paint with the vague brush. This is a thing that we used to talk about in the Games Workshop Design Studio, because especially in a thing like Games Workshop, where you're creating stuff which will be part of an ever-growing tapestry of rules and background, which will, have long-standing implications for the rest of the range for years to come. The worst thing you can do is paint yourself into a corner. So instead, you paint with a vague brush, and you maybe don't mention all the details of a particular thing. You give room for additional things down the line to add in or whatever else. So in this particular case, what I mean here is, if one element of the IP is causing issues, you can be vague about it and give yourself room to move. So for example, if you're making a game based on the movie adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you don't want to think about the exact number of otters or beavers even that were involved in the battle at the end, well, you can just be vague. Have a battalion of beavers and call it a day. You can just change your scope and focus on the valiant struggle of one armored beaver fighting an army of monsters and gnomes, whatever else it was. Exactly what's the weapon loadout on a particular starship in this particular sci-fi IP. Do you need to be specific, or could you use the vague brush and just not quite mention it and just call it starship weaponry or something? Be careful though, because the more things that you are vague about, the more chance there is that you're going to not bring those iconic elements to the fore, and you're going to make your game feel quite generic. I left a space before the full stop at the end of that sentence. That's going to bug me. I'll change that before I send these slides out. If you were to make a board game of Ghostbusters, they never established in the IP exactly how many ghosts you can fit into the containment unit, and neither do you. You can be vague. So yeah, the vague brush is your friend, but use it wisely. Of course, you can change perspective. If an element of the IP is causing issues, you can focus elsewhere, look at something different. You can use maybe characters who were just background characters in the source material. A great example of this was the video game Enter the Matrix, which I'm going back a while here, but just before the second Matrix movie came out, whichever year that was, they had a tie-in video game, and it's not the best example because they did it as part of the same. It was all kind of planned out around the same time, but basically they had a video game which was based on the adventures of a pair of side characters, basically, who didn't have a huge role in the movie, but you saw what they got up to at the same time as the movie was happening, and there were little points where it crossed over. And so they changed the focus so that you weren't tied in to the storyline of the movie in the video game, which I thought was a great idea. And you can do similar things with an IP in a board game. You can kind of go, well, actually, we know that let's go back to Star Wars. In Star Wars, we know the Battle of Yavin, these things were happening, and we followed Red Squadron as they went down into the trench. But actually, maybe we could focus on what was happening inside the Death Star at that point. And you can cross over with the storyline of the film, but you can not have to focus on exactly covering those elements that happen there, because that will give you more scope, maybe. So that's a second option you can use. There's a great example. So Games Workshop, they had a licensed role-playing game called Dark Heresy based on specifically one faction within the settings of the Inquisition, which are part of the Imperium in Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 universe, and they invented a whole new sector off to one side. It had never been mentioned before, but it was perfectly happening within the universe. Various events were referred to in the role-playing game, but it meant they could kind of have lots of freedom, and they didn't have to worry about bringing in all the different things that Games Workshop brought in. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's fantastic. Gergo's made a great point there. White Walkers are a very abstract element in the Game of Thrones board game, and it focuses on the power struggle between houses. Yeah, because they've chosen that the key thematic element of Game of Thrones they wanted to focus on was the power struggle, the Game of Thrones. The White Walkers, they're a very minor element in it. If none of that works, you can tell some little white lies. You can apply some artistic license. So when we did Hellboy, we had some characters whose abilities maybe didn't work exactly like they do in the comics. And similarly, Devil May Cry, we had each character. If you play Devil May Cry the video game, you'll have an encyclopedic knowledge once you've played enough of it of every single move the characters can make. There are guides you can buy which have great detailed things about the amount of damage a particular attack does, or how many frames it lasts, how far you move when you do it. And we changed a lot of it. A lot of it actually started off, the starting point was we just replicated the video game, but through testing and iteration, things deviated quite heavily from the source material. But because the exact number of steps you take when you do a big uppercut with your sword, that's not a key iconic element, people didn't notice. You can change quite a lot without people noticing or caring, as long as you keep those key iconic elements intact. And finally, the dangerous one, you can invent things from whole cloth, which is, I'm sure that's a phrase. I apologize if creating something from whole cloth is not a thing that you've heard before, but it basically means make it up from scratch. Occasionally, you might be able to invent completely new things. A good example of this was when Games Workshop, they've had the Middle-earth license for some time, and for a fair while in the mid-noughties, they were able to create new characters and new things within the IP in a very limited way. There was only a few things they could do this with, but they would create IP around. They would, for example, take maybe a character who was mentioned once by name in the Silmarillion or something, and then bring a whole load of extra background and narrative and IP and rules, extrapolate who that character was. And I think there were occasions where they completely created a character, from scratch. it's a thing that can cause issues. I remember I was working in Games Workshop stores at the time, and on several occasions we'd have a new release, and a hardcore Tolkien fan would come in and be very upset about the fact that we'd created a new character who didn't exist in the IP. So it's a thing you have to be very careful doing. Fans will get upset. The licensor might question it quite heavily, but it can get you out of a bind sometimes. It should very much be a last resort, though. And if you have to do this a lot, then you should be thinking, is this game, is this idea, is this right for this IP? If you can only make this game by inventing loads of stuff, maybe the game is conceptually wrong for this IP. So in summary, not every element of the IP is going to work for your game. Your first option is always to refocus and, look elsewhere. But if that doesn't work, you can bend the rules as long as you maintain those iconic elements. Only make big changes if it's absolutely necessary, or because that way lies madness, or more likely that way lies the license holder telling you, no, you can't do that. Please undo the thing you've done and do their work again. As far as I'm aware, we've never had a licensor tell us that we've completely missed the point and we have to start again. Normally they're very, very minor changes, but it's because we take the time to get as good as we can in terms of knowing what the IP is. So any questions on that before we come into our final planned section? Looks like no, so I'm going to move on. Let's look at ways to do it wrong. Now, I debated with this whether I should show examples of bad adaptation in board games, but I decided not to because I think it feels a bit mean. I don't want to, point out things people have done wrong, but if you go out there, you can look for like examples online of bad licensed games, and you will find them. And everything I'd mentioned here, there are plenty of examples of them. So yeah, basically it's very easy to make mistakes when working with an IP, and if you do, you will get harangued by the internet. They'll say you're just trying to make a cheap cash grab, and you will not feel like you've done a great job, and you probably won't make a great success with it. And although a lot of the time you'll still probably sell lots of copies of the game, you'll get no respect from other designers or from your customers. So here are the most common places that designers slip up. I've kept it quite brief. I could have gone on for a long time, but I wanted to keep it positive, So when you create a board game based on an IP, you are basically you're targeting three separate audiences. You've got fans of board games who like that IP or know that IP and like that IP. They're your core audience. But you've also got fans of board games who don't know that IP and fans of that IP that don't know board games. And it's very easy to just zone in and focus on the people that are both. But then you risk alienating a large section of your potential audience. So for the people that, they know the IP, they like the IP, but they're not board gamers, you need to make sure the game is accessible to them. As I said, with Hellboy, we had loads of people who are big fans of Hellboy, not board gamers. And I think in hindsight, we should have done more to make the game easy for them to pick up. Because a lot of people, they ended up buying it and putting the miniatures on shelves and displaying them as cool display pieces. That's great. To my mind, in hindsight, it would have been nice to have made it so that people who are just comics fans can easily play that game. And this thing we try to do more now. We consider that much more carefully. So you need to keep it accessible and tailor your complexity. So have a nice, easy onboarding system. You probably need to make your game more accessible if it's a licensed game. But also, the converse is true. And again, I think we didn't do a great job of this with Hellboy. If you've got gamers who like maybe your designs or a particular type of game that you're doing, but they don't know the IP, you've got to kind of hold their hand through it. You have to assume that this is their first experience of that IP. And with Hellboy, I think we massively dropped the ball by not introducing any of the characters in great detail. We just kind of assumed people would pick it up from seeing how they play. And the backs of the character sheets, there's a whole load of blank space. We could have put a little potted history of each character. So it's up to you to sell the setting and make sure that your gamer fan base are told what it is and why it is cool. And because that's one of the reasons why people, license holders will give out the licenses, because they might get new fans who come into, say, Hellboy through having played the board game because they like dungeon crawl type games. So remember, there is that balance. If you go too far in one direction, if you just go loads of like in jokes and references about the IP, you're going to risk alienating people that don't know what it is. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number two sounds obvious. Don't get the IP wrong. That research is vital. That I talked a lot at the start about doing research, identifying all the key things. You need to do that, because if you get it wrong, you lose a lot of credibility. And that's, themes, emotions, ideas, not just the iconic elements, but like, does your game feel right? Does it look right? Does the aesthetic fit? If the thing you're basing it on is all kind of, gritty, grimy, and you come out with like a, 1960s Adam West Batman style over the top colorful Dayglow thing, people will not associate it with the IP, and it will be dissonant, it will be jarring, and it will turn people off. You want to get fans of the IP to play the game while it's in development. Like I said, get your play testers, get people in there who know what the IP is, who you trust to give you opinions on it. The last resort is always to ask the license holder, because they'll have experts that can tell you exactly what it is. We recently did some work for a license, or for an IP, quite a large, prestigious, well-known series of books. And their licensing team had 3 or 4 super fans around the world who they said, we'll put you in touch with them. If you have any questions, ask them, and they'll come back to you within 24 hours with page references for everything you need to know. And that's fantastic. You won't always necessarily have access to that sort of thing, but you can often speak to the license holder and they will probably help you out. But again, the more you have to turn to them to ask about stuff, the less credibility you'll have going forward, and the more they'll start questioning whether you're really the right person to be doing this. Third one is, as I've said a couple of times already, is being slavish, trying to recreate every single element of the game. We were asked to help a games company a few years ago now polish up a game they'd done, which was based on a video game. And the first point of feedback we had was, you've tried to recreate the video game one for one. And the problem is that a video game, and this is often, we see this a lot, especially in video game licenses, computer games can do an awful lot that board games can't, because they have a lot of like stuff happening under the hood, so to speak. So they'll be tracking lots of information, they'll be doing complex maths, lots of like AI type stuff that's happening very quickly. And when you put that onto the tabletop, and it just bogs the game down, and everything takes forever. And what is a quick 10-second loop in the video game will take an hour, and that becomes the thing your game is about. And if that thing was not what the video game was about, that was a very quick 10-second thing in the video game in between, the important things you're doing, then it's not going to feel like the video game, and you've gone wrong. So you need to, again, figure out which elements of the IP suit this specific medium and focus on them. If it doesn't fit, cut it out. Be brutal. We talk a lot in our Game Zone course on murdering your darlings, as in you find the things that are just in there because you wanted to put them in there. If they don't fit and they don't make sense, remove them, kill them, get rid of them. And go back to that. What are your iconic elements? What does your design brief say? What have you agreed with the license holder? Go back to that. And anything outside of that is, you can remove it potentially. And the last one I've got here is assuming that a license is a silver bullet. When Kickstarter was first a thing in the board games world, so 2013, 2014, I was working at Mantic Games, and we had some of the earliest board game successes on Kickstarter in Dreadpool, Dead Zone. I think that Dead Zone crossed, it was a second board game, I think it was, to cross $1 million on Kickstarter. But people started realizing that putting a licensed game on Kickstarter was a great way to make money. And very quickly, you started seeing loads of them. But very quickly, the consumer became wise to this and realized that a license doesn't mean a good game. And it got to the point where actually seeing a licensed game that was good was a real standout moment. So when Gale Force 9 did Spartacus Blood and Sand, everyone was saying, look, it's a board game that's licensed, but it's a good game. And it was very similar to what you saw like in the 80s and 90s in video games, where licensed tie-in video games were a thing that always happened. Whenever a film came out, there'd be a video game. And a lot of the time it would be rushed out the door, and it would just be kind of the IP would be plastered onto it. They'd change a few sprites to look like the video, like the film or whatever it was that it was based on, and the game would be rubbish. And so then when a good video game movie, a good movie-based video game came out, it was a real remarkable thing. These days, that's not the case in video games, and it's decreasingly the case in board games. Whatever the case, though, you still can't rely on having an IP to sell your game. It has to be a good game first and foremost, and a good licensed game second. So in summary, there are loads of bad licensed games out there. There are lots of games making these mistakes and more. Study them. Go out and make an effort to play bad games. I tell people to play bad games wherever you can, because you'll start seeing mistakes in your own designs before they become mistakes that will cause you issues. So go out and avoid them. I was going to say any questions. I can see there's already something in here from Hugh. Let me read this. I saw an explanation included in a licensed board game for those new to the setting of the version of Call to Adventure based on Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight archive book series. There was a big section explaining various major elements. Yes, fantastic. It was more spoilery than you liked, but maybe it's better than having nothing at all. Yeah, absolutely. Call to Adventure, you're supposed to tell your character story at the end based on a series of cards, which is almost impossible in this version without knowing the Stormlight archive books very well. Yeah, so not sure if it makes that providing a tiny bit of information better or worse. Yeah, so I think you need to be careful, because what you don't want to do is, if someone's first introduction to that IP is your game, you don't want to spoil loads of elements, right? You don't want to kind of bring stuff in that is going to ruin that source material for them if they go back and read it. So I think you have to kind of be careful. And I think this is, again, why it's important to have a mixture of fans and not fans in your playtesting group. One of the things we talk about in our other seminars is when you're playtesting, you want to have a variety of different people with different backgrounds, and you will get that feedback from them. It's much better to spoil it for one person by mistake than to put it in a game that we've seen by thousands of people. You can apologize to one playtester for spoiling stuff to them. But yeah, again, testing, more blood in training, less blood on the battlefield, as the saying goes. Any more questions on common pitfalls? And if not, we're moving into the last Q&A section. I've got some questions which were sent in by email, which I haven't yet answered in the bulk of the talk, although I might have done just through general anecdotes and things. I'll ask those, and if you've got any more general questions on adapting properties or anything else, you can ask away. And as I've said before, I will be sending out access to the Discord server for this. I'll send that out to you in the email tomorrow not tomorrow, because tomorrow is Sunday, isn't it? It'll be Monday, I'll send it out to you. I'll have the recording, all the slides, and link to our Discord server where you can come on. Basically, you can ask any questions you've got. I'm on there most of the time. If I don't answer immediately, just tag me, because I'm usually quite busy. But I'll happily come on and answer any questions you've got about this stuff or anything else we've talked about in this or any other seminars. I have the feeling there's a big, long question coming in. Oh, no, here we go. What if the project falls through, but you have a mechanically sound design? Yeah, great question. This has happened to us several times, where we've been really proud of the game that we've made based on a licensing agreement, and then for whatever reason it's fallen through. Thankfully, it's never fallen through with us where we've had to pay the licensing fee up front. It's been where there's been a publishing partner, and they brought us in to design the game, and the relationship's just fallen apart, or something's happened, and they have had to cancel the project, and we've got a mechanically sound game. Kind of sucks, right? You've got three options. First option is say, ho hum, never mind, move on with your life. That's the kind of the least effort but least satisfying one. Second one is to retheme your game and release it anyway. So if if you've got your Star Wars license and you've made an amazing Star Wars game, but then the license falls through, well, hey, I mean, you change a few names, right? And it will evoke Star Wars, but it won't be Star Wars. And you won't have all that sort of reach that you get from having a license, but you'll have a game which Star Wars fans will hopefully enjoy. So you can do that. The third option is kind of between the two, which is reuse elements of that game. When you scrap a game design, nothing is wasted. I've got games when we've got like a whole like kind of ship graveyard of games that have been scrapped over the years, and we're always pulling out elements. Whenever we sit down to design a new game, one of the first things we'll talk about is there anything we can reuse from stuff that didn't get used in the past, or even stuff that didn't get used, because actually you can reuse elements from games quite easily without feeling like you're just copying your own work. So yeah, if a project falls through, but you have mechanically sound design, you can carry on going. You can just change a few things and be all right. If you have a really good idea for a game that you have vaguely based on IP, you may struggle to get hold of the IP or after reviewing the pros and cons from saying what to detach from it. Would it be something to consider revisiting your own setting? Yeah, like I just said, if that's the case, then you can definitely kind of go, well, let's it's not Star Wars now. Now it's space battles, and the evil Federation are, sending their fleets of planet killers, to et cetera, and you can kind of retheme it. And you've got to be careful. You can't be too on the nose with it, but it's actually amazing how much impact you can have by making a few small changes. And again, fans of the IP will get it. There's a role-playing game called Scum and Villainy, which is not Star Wars. And at no point was it obviously designed with a Star Wars license in mind. It's an indie role-playing game. But I know an awful lot of people who just play it as Star Wars. They just change a few elements and they play it as Star Wars, because why would you not? So yes, there we go. Here are some quick questions that we had on the emails, which I have not yet answered. Can you adapt an existing tabletop game into another tabletop game? Yes, I think I might have actually already answered that one. So you can take a board game and create a new board game using the same setting, the same IP. You can absolutely do that. You can take a board game, make a role-playing game, make a card game. You can take a board game and create something which really zooms in on one element of it. You can make, you see this quite a lot. So a great example is Fantasy Flight. They are very good at using every part of the buffalo, so to speak. So look at their Arkham games. Now they're technically based off the Lovecraft mythos, but really they've got their own set of characters within those games, and the way those games play out thematically is nothing like any of Lovecraft's books. You can't win in a Lovecraftian setting by using more shotguns, but they kind of have their own thing with that, and they've done multiple games which spin off and use the same characters sometimes, certainly the same settings, but they're whole different types of game. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, the Android universe from Fantasy Flight, they've created a game originally, the Android board game. They've incorporated Netrunner. There's New Angeles. There's a little kind of abstract game which involves you kind of placing things on a board and trying to block each other's paths and things. They've also done books and things. Once you've kind of created a game, that is an IP. So you can absolutely base other things off it. This is a really interesting question that came in. There's a question that I forget who it was that asked it. Someone asked over email, do games based on history count as licensed games? So not quite. Say you want to make a game based on the Battle of Waterloo, for example. What's interesting is a lot of the same stuff applies, but crucially, it's not a licensed game because you're not having to get someone's permission to use their intellectual property. However, there are lots of other considerations to make. So, for example, yes, you're doing the same thing, that you're trying to recreate certain, characters, or, historical figures, really, settings, events, whatever it might be. So you're doing that whole thing of like evoking key elements in the same way that you are with a licensed game, but you're not having to worry about the legal side of things. You might have to if you cross over into anything which becomes recognizable. So, for example, if you did a Napoleonic game which happened to be very close to the Sharp TV series and had various characters in it which were drawn from the Sharp novels, maybe, then at that point you're not basing it on history, you're basing it on a series of novels or a TV show. So at that point it becomes a licensed situation. Also, you have to be careful to be respectful, though, because historical things, involve real people. And the question is, how far back do you have to go for it to be okay? There was a game released, I think last year, it might have been a board game, or at least I heard about it last year, which was called Deck Chairs on the Titanic. And I mean, it comes from a saying of, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, as in it's an idiom meaning to, carry out a futile task, basically. And the board game was literally about arranging deck chairs on the Titanic as it's about to sink. And there was quite a backlash. A lot of people were like, oh, that's too soon. Even though it's been like, what, 100 years yet? It must be 105 years or so. So people weren't happy that was a thing that was being used in a board game. So you have a whole different set of issues when it comes to adapting a historical set of events into a board game. But I think there is probably stuff in this talk. I think the middle chunk of this talk tonight will still be relevant to historical stuff. Whoever, if you answered that question, if you asked that question, sorry, I hope I've answered it. How do you create balance in a situation that isn't balanced in the source material? How do you make Ewoks and Stormtroopers have a battle and the Ewoks win? Okay, with you. Awesome, thank you. So my first question is: does it need to be balanced? Is balance the thing that makes it engaging? If so, then maybe you can shift your focus. If you wanted to do a game which is, the Battle of Endor in Star Wars, and you want to do it, and you can't make it work that Ewoks make sense winning, an Ewok will never be the equal of a Stormtrooper, maybe, and an awful lot of dramatic license was clearly involved in the movie. And it maybe doesn't make sense logically from your point of view in the movie itself for it to happen that way. Well, then maybe you can either zoom in or zoom out, look at a particular thing, look at a game which is just about Ewok trying to build traps to overcome the Empire or something. Is that the fun part? Or is the fun part that the Ewoks are hopelessly outnumbered and only by getting incredibly lucky can they win the game? At which point is the game all about trying to do as much as you can before you're overwhelmed? And the canonical version is where they got incredibly lucky and it all kind of went in their favor. So, as I said before, you can refocus, you can zoom out, you can look elsewhere. Look at those rules I put in earlier for kind of reshaping an IP to make that work. I had one question, which was, how do you approach adapting a property you don't know much about? The first question is, ask yourself why you're doing it, because you're making a lot of work for yourself. It's much easier to start with a property that you're familiar with. But then secondly, you have to just do a heck of a lot of research. I think I kind of covered that quite nicely earlier. But yeah, basically, if you don't know the IP, it's your duty to get to know it before you start designing. And then finally, how closely does an adaptation need to be tied to a source IP? The context for this was the person who asked was looking at creating a board game version of a video game they'd created. So it's a slightly interesting, different thing, because it's adapting an existing property without the whole licensing agreement side of things, because it's property they already own. I would say the answer is it needs to evoke those key iconic elements so that the customer base, the players, will recognize it as being part of the same. If you're in the position where you've got a successful video game that's already out there, people have played it, you've got a fan base, ask yourself, what are the things that you need to do so that's my dog barking. What are the things you need to do to make it recognizable as part of that same world, that same setting? Can you work with the same themes and maybe the same aesthetics, the same graphics? I looked at the video game; it's got a very recognizable look to it. So can you use the same look and some of the same themes, but change the gameplay and setting completely, and have it still feel like part of the same thing? Maybe. So I think you need to have links generally through those iconic elements, but it's remarkable how much you can change and still have it feel appropriate to that IP. are there any more questions? That's not the end of what I've got planned. So if there are any more questions about anything at all about we talked about tonight or anything else, any of the projects I've worked on previously, any of the games I've designed, if you've got questions about anything else that's on your mind relating to game design generally, feel free to ask away now, and I'll answer what I can. Otherwise, the Discord server is a great place to ask questions. We've got a dedicated channel called Course Attendees, which is just for people who have been on these courses, and it's a lovely community on there. The game designers are, lots of people are keen to help each other out and stuff. So feel free to ask on there if you haven't got any questions now. Looks like there's not much coming in. My voice is giving up. I've not spoken this much in a couple of weeks, so I'm glad I didn't do this last week, because I would not have been able to get through this. So thank you all for being patient with me. If there are no questions, I will finish up and say thank you ever so much. I love doing these seminars, and I'm really looking forward to doing Game Design Online, which is starting, I think, on Thursday next week and running weekly for 6 weeks. If you've enjoyed this, the main way that we let people know about this stuff, and the main way people find out about this stuff, is by other people telling them about it. So please spread the word. It would do us a massive favor if we can get the word out about these. If you want to use social media with hashtags, hashtag NeedyCat Design Course is always, it's nice to be able to check that hashtag and see what people are saying about this. If you have any feedback on the course, feel free to email it to me. I will not take offense. If there are things you'd prefer me to do differently in the future, let me know. I can't make it better unless I know that it can be made better. Look out for an email from me on Monday. If you haven't had anything from me, drop me a line, let me know. And I've got to do my little plug, haven't I? Obligatory plug for Game Design Online. It's a 6-part course. If you use code Teach Me More, you will get discounted stuff. I think it's maybe 10%, maybe 15%, maybe even 20%. I can't remember exactly how much it is, but you'll get a discounted rate to get it. It's normally £60. Hang on, I've said that now. Is it 60? I'm going to double check that. It's an amount of money, and it's 6 seminars, 6 hours worth of this, basically 6 hours of me talking about game design. And we really do go through, £60, here we go. And we go through our entire process, talking about how we design games in-house. So it's a great course. Oh, thank you, Renato. It's very, very kind of you to say so. We talk about the way in which we design games. And if you've done any of our other courses, so this one, we did one on dungeon crawlers, we did a couple of miniatures games, all of them kind of dovetail into that course, and it's all designed to work together. We're really proud of the seminars that we do and the way they that builds a foundation, and these ones kind of focus on particular areas. Will this replace the course in 2020? Yes, it will. And if you've already purchased a ticket, if you've already had the 2020 course, if you attended it live or you've bought it again since, you automatically have access to the new one. I'll send you all the links and everything, so you can come along and watch it live if you want to. If you've watched the recordings already, you can come along and attend the live courses. You'll get the new recordings. I'll have less beard. It was early lockdown. What can I say? The beard went a bit crazy. But yeah, if you've already been on it, that's part of the reason for wanting to do it was I wanted to update it, because a lot's happened in the last couple of years. I feel like I've got better at delivering seminars, and I wanted to kind of redo it. So if you've already got it, don't worry, you will get all the links when they come out. So that is that really. That's me for the night. So thank you ever so much. If you have any more questions, as I say, get them on Discord or email me, whatever it is. I'm generally quite reachable. I make myself far too reachable. I completely devalue access to me. But thank you so much for coming along. I hope this has been useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do tell people if you've had a good time. Anything at all else? There's someone typing. I'm not gonna finish up before I've answered whatever it is they're going to say. Thank you for the course. You're very welcome. That's good. It's been interesting. Fantastic. And if you make games using any of the stuff that is based in here, let us know. I'll gladly give you a push, give you some promo, share stuff about what you're doing. I love to hear when people use the contents of our course to go and make games. It makes me genuinely happy. There have been about half a dozen, I think, games made by people that have come through our course, and even if they learned nothing from it and it was all their own work, it gives me warm fuzzies to know that they've then kind of gone on and done things having been through our course. So thank you very much. I'm going to go and have a warm drink and recover my voice maybe. Have a great rest of the weekend, and if you're watching this after the fact. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great time, everyone. See you later.